Hello and welcome to The Drum. I'm Dan Borscher, coming to you from the lands of the Gadigal people. Coming up, the age of entitlement. Former Treasurer Joe Hockey warns of the cancer of populist politics. Debunking depression, Professor Ian Hickie on the myths and the treatments that really work. And the 4-day work week. As corporate Australia embraces the model, does it really all add up? Joining me on the panel, Head of the Brain and Mind Centre at the University of Sydney, Ian Hickie. Wonderful to have you back.
Thanks, Dan.
In Canberra, National Political Editor for News Corp Australia, Claire Armstrong. Good to have you along as well. And in Melbourne, business owner and Red Balloon founder Naomi Simpson. Welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me.
And you can join us online using the hashtag The Drum, and we live stream on Facebook as well. First tonight, a former federal treasurer has let fly at a political class he calls populist and afraid of making tough decisions. A decade ago, Joe Hockey used a speech to a London think tank to warn of, quote, an age of entitlement and government spending beyond their means. Overnight, he returned to the same venue to say debt levels are even higher and entitlement culture is even worse.
Today, I am warning our legislators and leaders that it is their entitlement that is the problem. The entitlement to hold on to power. The entitlement to be popular no matter what the cost. That sense of entitlement, that you can give people everything they want, is a cancer in our community. We will all pay a price.
Under Prime Minister Tony Abbott, Mr Hockey's first budget in 2014 proposed a raft of cuts to spending and subsidies, facing fierce Senate opposition and a public polling backlash. But Mr Hockey says politicians need to stand tough on decisions in the name of budget sustainability. Claire, I want to start with you. You're at Parliament, a cancer on the community. Is he right? What did you take from this?
I'm not sure how revelatory it is that politicians whose jobs quite literally depend on winning a popularity contest every 3 years are therefore compelled to do things that are popular. So, I mean, it's an interesting to have this discussion again, but I'm not sure how nuanced or new the former Treasurer's views are there. I think the issue that's quite interesting to me is that obviously, as you flagged there, Hockey, when he was in government, did make a lot of cuts, but often, particularly on the right wing of politics, centre-right politics, this discussion around doing things that are popular rather than, hard, it always comes down to spending cuts, spending on public service, spending on services, very rarely on things like incentives to people that are not necessarily a spend, such as your franking credits, your negative gearing on housing. So I always find it more interesting that this is often framed around direct money out rather than actually looking at how a government can balance a budget through revenue raising just as much as restrained spending. Yeah,
it's an interesting point you make about the mechanisms there. Naomi, I saw you nodding your way there as Claire was talking about, well, some of those big spending items that continue to be discussed, negative gearing, capital gains tax and the like.
One could argue that they're tactics in the overall fiscal scheme. And so really the challenge that we have with leadership is really stating what the North Star looks like and what do we want to stand for as a nation and who do we want to be and how we're going to fund that as well. And it's quite right, in terms of how we raise funds, it doesn't always have to come from taxes. If we look at the Norwegian model and their impact investing fund, which has come from the taxes of the fossil fuels, and they've used that obviously to transform their economy and be the largest fund of its type in the world. And we have a small one, but I think first of all leadership is about saying, well, what could it look like? And then what are all of the different tactics, fiscal, monetary, economic, social, and how do we have those really grown-up conversations? And as a people, we don't want to be treated like children. Social media plays such a big role in this, but it started way before social media, and that is when it went to a 24-hour news cycle with CNN and then followed on by Foxtel. And of course, Foxtel thought news was to be entertaining. And as such, they needed to always find something to talk about. And if there's nothing to talk about, then, well, we better dig up something else or look for a different angle. And that, of course, has just been absolutely amplified, not just with social media, but in terms of all electronic and digital media. So I am concerned that we're not able to have robust debate and discussion to include different viewpoints to ultimately come up with a plan. And therefore it does become, well, what's my quick win? What can I get away with only a 3-year term, which is a very short term if you're really trying to change, let's say, the whole of the taxation system.
There's an interesting point there about that sovereign wealth fund in Norway, because one of the key benchmarks of that was bipartisanship, wasn't it? Throughout that process, I think it was in the 60s, 70s and 80s, getting everyone together to find out what are the compromises we need, how do we make sure this doesn't have a negative effect on the economy, have it outside, etc., etc. Does that tie into what you're talking about around that lack of the political discourse?
Well, I'm really concerned that the language in so many different areas is now you're either with me or you're against me. And it's about the me, it's not about the idea. Interesting podcast came out many months ago, but the witch trials of J.K. Rowling, which is how is it that we can no longer have debate in a public domain without people either being cancelled, criticised and absolutely abused, like polarised. And it's not about what the conversation was, it was about how do we have debate for the good, because people have many and various ideas. So I'm really concerned that we are so biopic. There's only two ways, there's right and there's wrong, when there's a plethora of other things that we could put into a plan. But it does require that, not just bipartisan view, but inclusion of all sorts of different voices. At the moment, we've got the person yelling the loudest seems to get their way, and that is not leadership. It's how do we include the introverts in the conversation.
It strikes me that we've been having a big exploration of different views this very year. Claire, I think you wanted to jump in there.
Yeah, I was just going to add, I think what maybe has been lost or is lost in a lot of political discussion is a thorough explanation by politicians of the moral imperatives behind some tough decisions. And we've seen throughout history that the public are often willing to get on board, even if something is going to cost them more or give them less, if they can understand and appreciate the moral imperative for doing that, whether it's acting on climate, whether it's ensuring we have a social safety net, whether it's, roads to drive on that obviously benefit everyone. And I think perhaps where Hockey is perhaps right is that in pursuit of just sustaining a position within government, there's maybe not as much focus or attention paid on bringing the electorate with you on a difficult decision to explain to them why it's actually a broader benefit or why we should do something.
And Ian, this goes to what is often a discussion about in politics. It's often about short-term gain without having the conversation about are there long-term costs, and if so, what are those?
Where should we make the long-term investments? For who? What's the collective benefit to be gained over time? We have so many challenges in health, in education, in welfare, in transformation of the economy, in terms of the energy policies, and a lot of other areas. People want serious leadership. I'm trying to think with Joe Hockey, what did he ever believe in? What was the thing that he took forward? I can't remember. Just saying we're going to cut services. Somehow there's an intrinsic good. Cut healthcare, cut education. What do we spend on defence? What's the serious conversation between the political class? How do people make the argument over time that may well lead to compromises and serious long-term investments that require change and require us to do things differently? I think what's been lost is the trust between the voting public and the political class. What do they stand for? What is the argument for the so-called hard choices to be made? How is it sustained? When we've seen things happen, I think the National Disability Insurance Scheme, we've seen whole new things come into operation when there was agreement we needed to do something in that area. We have seen other attempts in health and education to take that forward, but we get stuck in the short-term politics. Just what's the cost? Not what is the longer-term gain, how does that be organised, and then how do we stick through the implementation of that to make sure we're on the right track? So I think, it's kind of interesting for the politician to turn around, not one that I remember as being at the forefront of great ideas, to say, oh, the problem is now people are populist. I think the trust issue between the political class and what is in our long-term collective interest is seriously being questioned.
And when Joe Hockey got into power, it was about a year after that speech that he gave about the entitlement at the first instance. His party was there through until, early last year. So how much of this speech is actually aimed at his own side of politics who have been in power for the last decade?
Well, it sounds like he would have expected them to reduce all of that, as if somehow that was intrinsically good or good for business or good for all of us. And of course, that's not what happened. So perhaps that's where it is intentioned. I think what he's picking up, though, is perhaps a bigger frustration that many people have, short-term politics versus long-term collective good. And who is making the argument? Where is the leadership in the current political classes towards longer term? We all know there are serious challenges in all of the things we rely on: health, education, social services, transport, energy. We know there are serious problems. We know they're long-term, not short-term. But where is the political leadership that has conviction and is prepared to be engaged with a range of stakeholders that Amy was talking about? There's a range of views. There's no simple solution. No. There's a range, and a consensus needs to be reached, like the Sovereign Wealth Fund, like the transformation in other economies, to make those changes, not who wins and loses on social media today.
Yeah, if things were simple, I suspect that'd already be happening. And this all plays into a conversation about power. And we've had a rare window this week into how the wealthy attempt to influence the political class. Australian business titan Anthony Pratt has been caught on tape boasting of his powerful connections and how he invests in maintaining them. In leaked recordings published by 9 newspapers, the billionaire chairman of Visy Industries reveals consulting payments to former prime ministers and access to global power players such as Donald Trump, Rudy Giuliani, Rupert Murdoch, and even Prince Charles before he became king.
What I am trying to do is network with people who can be useful. My superpower is that I am rich, so I am useful to him, right? All these guys are like the mafia. Trump, Rupert, Rudy. You want to be a customer, not a competitor. And I am very aware of that.
There's no suggestion of any illegality from Mr. Pratt, but the FBI is reportedly investigating claims that former President Donald Trump passed on secret US military information to the Australian businessman. 9 investigative reporter Nick McKenzie says the tapes show how money and power can work.
We suspect the wealthy and powerful in the business world seek these relationships for their own interests. We can see it happening sometimes from a distance, but very rarely do we see these very powerful business people explain, albeit while they're not knowing they're being recorded, about what it is that they're actually seeking in their own words. That's the power of these recordings.
Claire, I want to start with you because at the base of this really is a question about power, who has access to it and why that might be the case. I wonder what insights you've gained into those relationships and those processes working out of Parliament House where you are now in the very senior role you're in.
I'm sure it wouldn't surprise Australians, although it probably disappoints even discuss them, that money does go a long way when it comes to accessing decision makers in this country, as in, I would argue any country in the world. We have a relatively robust system around transparency on lobbyists, but it doesn't go anywhere near as far as some other Western democracies. So I guess what I would say I observe is that a natural part of governing and being in opposition, being in Parliament, often means that you turn to outsiders for, sometimes you seek input on policies and issues, other times they're raised with you. And the surest way for that is if you can afford it, if you're a peak body, if you're an organisation, a company that can afford to have a government relations staff that can then engage in that activity by lobbying government. It's pretty similar here to what you would expect around the world, although obviously we don't quite have the scale that you would see in America in terms of the level of money that is spent.
Naomi, for anyone who's outside of the political class, the political system, I wonder, does this story just reinforce the view that if you have money, you can get that kind of influence with decision makers?
Look, perhaps, but I think of the flow-on effect throughout potentially the economy. So it's interesting the word you use, which is just power, as if it is a noun or a sort of person. And power, it resides where there's an absence of influence on the other party. So I'm particularly thinking about, well, how could this have applied in Australia? Where would they use that power? We have, as we've already said, far more scrutiny. And I'm thinking about Qatar and the Senate inquiry to make sure that these decisions are being scrutinised. So power could be not just a person, it could be a corporation. And it is all about checks and balances when you live in a democracy. But if you're in small business, you have no power. You often are treated as if you're a bank when you deal with large corporations, which is why businesses now have to report on their payment terms for small businesses. But is money equal to power? In this case, Pratt says it is.
Ian, we're also constantly having a conversation about trust in politics, in politicians, in our democratic institutions. Where does this all sit alongside that discussion?
Well, if you want to undermine trust, if you want to say some people have a preferential voice and a very influential voice, I think as Anthony Pratt said, it's about the utility of that. I'm going to use that. I'm not just giving advice. I'm going to use it. I think we saw during the debate in Australia about mining taxes and whether we'd have a sovereign wealth fund and whether we'd share certain voices that were very powerful, very well cashed up, were able to run their own campaigns, were able to change the decisions of governments. This is not just power for power's sake, it's being used preferentially to support certain interests. So if you're not in there and you don't have that degree of wealth and that degree of influence, the things you care about may well be marginalised in that contest of where government activity takes place. So I think a lot of Australians at a lot of levels, they won't be surprised, but they'll still be shocked. But just how blatant to say, I am using my money. It's a superpower. A superpower. It's an interesting kind of way of seeing yourself. Little shirt and everything else, I'm going in to tell the Prime Minister, actually, this is what I want, or the President of the United States, or an industry or a corporation says, the airline example, we want this and not that. But what's in the public interest? So I think it does go to this kind of, can we trust those systems to take account of the collective view, not just the view of some very selective groups that will use that power specifically in their own interests, and being very upfront about that.
Yeah.
Well, I suppose that goes back to the Joe Hockey point about populist decisions. If somebody comes along with their wealthy approach and says this is what I want and it's the best for the country without any level of public discussion or, as I said, the introverts and other groups being able to have and contribute to those conversations, that's where those two things come together.
It's a good point. We're going to have to move on. 1 in 5 Australians will experience clinical depression in their lifetime. Despite its prevalence, depression remains a mental health disorder many struggle to properly understand. The internet has reputable resources which help many to navigate this space, but it can also act as a vehicle to spread misinformation about the symptoms and the causes, as well as the best course of treatment. In a new book titled The Devil You Knew, our panellist Ian Hickey goes about trying to debunk the myths surrounding depression. Ian, let's start at the beginning here, the basic definition of clinical depression and just how prevalent is this in Australia?
So this is the point to start. Okay, I was originally the CEO of Beyond Blue, a national awareness campaign back in the 2000s with Jeff Kennett and all that. We all had to develop a language. Now we've all got a language. So we all say depressed, sure, I know that. That's sad, that's reacting to events. That's a normal mood state. So 5 out of 5 of us are going to have that. But only 1 out of 5 of us are going to have something else. I had a great experience earlier this year at the Royal Society of Medicine in London, reading their history books. They have an anatomy of melancholy, going back to the Greeks, describing an illness that affects people and changes them physically. So the physiology of your stress response system, your hormonal system, your immune system, your sleep-wake or circadian system is fundamentally altered in this state, which is not the same as the ordinary moodiness, which the rest of us makes us human. So in fact, when people get clinical depressed, they often lose their sense of pleasure in life. They lose their emotionality. They're not just more sad, they've lost a fundamental aspect of their life, and that is poorly understood. So the literacy and the terminology has gone up, but people's understanding of what's really gone on hasn't really increased in the same way, despite the fact the research I'm tied up with every day is about what's really going on in your brain, what's really going on in your body. So Now we can add to what the Greeks wrote about with a lot of actually the physiology of that, the chemistry of that, the brain changes associated with that. And this book, a bit of an old way to do it, to use a book rather than the internet, is to kind of say, now look, if you ever get involved in this or you ever go to the healthcare system, you need to have an understanding of this to get good healthcare, because it's a lot more sophisticated than you think.
So this is what you're saying there is that this is not just about feeling flat. This is much deeper about fundamentally your physiology and what impact it is having on you. So when we hear people say just go out and get some sunshine or go for a run.
Right. So then the simplicity becomes, look, if you just exercise more, you just eat better, you just get morning sunlight, you just change some minor circumstances in your life, everything will be fine. Now, for the rest of us, we need to do a lot of those things for our mental health and well-being every day. But if you're in this group, it's different. It's not like that. So the lack of empathy, the lack of understanding of many of us for someone who's in that situation, and many of us will have to accompany someone in this situation to healthcare to go, look, I know what it is to be sad. I know what it is to have a bad day. I know what it is to react against the things I don't like, which have happened in this country recently or overseas. That's not clinical depression. This is a different thing, which is not invented by the American Psychiatric Association, not invented by the pharmaceutical industry. It's been around since the Greeks as a physiological thing. And now we have a tremendous amount of possibilities to do better. You've got to know about it. You've got to actually understand what it's like. So depression's like fever or headache or back pain. It's just a big descriptive term. So when someone says, I've been diagnosed with depression, that's like saying, yeah, so you've got back pain, you've got headache, but what is it? Is it really serious? Is it something that is much more requires investigation, specific treatment? And get to what is your problem and what will be the optimal treatment for you. And that's a journey. That's not simple. We need to undertake that journey together.
And I suspect this is one of the challenges with so much material being available online, because it does allow myths to gain traction, doesn't it?
Yes, we're in the age of truthiness. Anything will do. Anything. Truthiness. Stephen Colbert, the American comic. In the Trump era, truth's not really required, just truthiness. It just sort of sound true. It's often false.
Alternate facts.
It's alternate facts, all that kind of stuff. So the internet is filled with things that say, and because people do care about their mental health now, and it's a big industry, there are all sorts of things, and people want to get better, and people want to take actions themselves, and people are sceptical and they're scared often of their health system, of what's unknown, so they often try to do those things. So there are, of course, as was emphasised in your intro, there are good things, but you need to know what that is. But also it's a journey of self-discovery. It's an issue of finding out what for you gets you out of the hole and keeps you out of the hole, gets the devil off your back and leaves it behind.
So what are the risks then of those myths, or of being consumed by self-diagnosis perhaps?
Well, being misled, ending up with wrong treatments, rejecting treatments that might help. When I was involved in Beyond Blue, we had national surveys. Half of Australians didn't get good health care. 20 years later, we thought this would be really different. A month ago, we had the release of national statistics. Half Australians still don't get good mental health care. We haven't actually made that much progress in convincing a lot of people that we know more, but the real issue is not just whether the treatments work, getting the treatment that works for you to sustain you. And that's complex, and that's not easy. We don't have an easy brain scan, we don't have an easy blood test that says, look, do this, this is what it is, trust me, we've got it sorted, and we'll track it. So there's still a lot of unknowns at the personal level, but we have a lot of good things there that need you to know more, because then you get better healthcare, to help the people close to you, but also to have a healthcare system that takes the whole thing so much more seriously.
Yeah, and just before I bring in the rest of the panel, why do you think it is that things haven't got better in that period of time that you mentioned?
Well, every minister and person I talk to, they go like, why is that so?
Yeah.
Well, it's an interesting thing, because I think we haven't got as far along the line of developing a better healthcare system. The research has kind of gone in steps and starts, and that's how it happens in medical research. Big breakthroughs in the 90s, not a lot of progress in the intervening period. So we have a lot of brain imaging, a lot of genotyping going on, genetic studies, a lot of new biochemical studies, but we haven't seen the kind of sensational breakthroughs, because guess what? Brains are really complicated. People are really complicated at different stages of life. So we haven't seen the kind of breakthroughs that give people confidence. What we have is a lot of good things, but we need to match them to the individuals at their heart, not just provide them en masse psychological care or en masse medicines. That hasn't convinced people that we've gone far enough.
Naomi, I want to bring you in because you run a successful business, and I think now we are probably much more aware of the impact mental health has on our team members, but also the work-life balance thing. How do you navigate all of these really complicated, sensitive conversations?
Before I answer that, Ian, I've got a question for you, which is, Because I want to answer the question correctly. And as you said, some people just have a bad day, and that is maybe an experience of sadness or whatever. But is it a deep hopelessness? Like you just can't see any glimmer of light? Is that... I just want to make sure that in answering that question, I'm not talking about, somebody's going through a grieving process or, there's many different kind of aspects to sadness. But is it just, I actually can't see my way forward, it's hopelessness?
So that's one of the key cognitive characteristics. The other point I make in the book is that people need to understand it's the physiological aspect. Think about prolonged jet lag for those of us who travel. Imagine when you're jet lagged, your head's in one part, you sleep somewhere over the Pacific, your gut's somewhere over the Atlantic, it's all disconnected. You just got no energy, you can't do anything, you're trying to concentrate, but you know that you're physiologically off. Just imagine being like that for weeks. And you can't see it ending and you can't explain it. You can't really explain why I'm in that situation, but I'm physiologically perturbed because all those intrinsic systems that I was talking about, stress response, hormones, immune, they are all disconnected. They're all out of whack. So that's the physiological aspect. But you essentially hopelessness, but also anhedonia, lack of hedonism, lack of pleasure. You can't enjoy, for me, your grandchildren. You can't enjoy your work. You can't enjoy the most fabulous spring day it is outside. It just isn't there. So the life has gone out of it. That's really different to just reacting to difficult circumstances or trying to cope with stuff. And as I say, the rest of us know what that other thing is. Only a small proportion of us really know the deep hopelessness, the physiological change, which is common but really different.
One of the reasons I ask the question is because small business owners or business owners have so much responsibility on their shoulders, and it is, not only are they employers, but if they have a really bad day or there is a sense of this absolute hopelessness, and they go home, they can't share it with anybody. They can't share it with their family. They can't share it with their friends. They have this certain sense of feeling of failure. They don't know if it's them. And then they might read the business press and they see X, Y and Z has just raised all this money, or these people have gone through this incredible growth, or these people have done their IPO. And it's this real sense of, oh my God, I am working my tail off and I am getting nowhere. But I think that, and that's been a massive concern over the last 3 years. Victoria, worse than anywhere else. New South Wales, second only, which is just, I've worked my whole life. I thought my business was worth something. I could sell it and one day, someday, have a retirement. And now I find that, I've used up all of my life savings and now I'm basically at square one. So, for me, and then when we look at the employee experience, I'm wondering about how much the external of this notion of comparison is compounding somebody's own experience. So, employers of choice, I don't work for a best employer. They're all having a better time over there. And I know we've got more stories coming later on that, but, these American companies are giving away free muesli bars. Looks pretty good over there. So this notion of, the grass is always greener and versus, and what can I change in my circumstance as an employee, you can move. But we as employers have such a responsibility to our team members. We also have to honour and respect their privacy. So most businesses now engaged in external services to provide almost a triage approach that if something happens, it might be a grief event, it might be an external event that's happened overseas that is impacting our community and our team members' ability to be the best version of themselves. We provide those services, but that's not available necessarily to small business owners, and I'm talking micro businesses as well. They're very alone.
Well, you raise one of the most important points I address in the book, which is people often think acute life event, something really goes wrong, and then they react to it, is the common cause of depression or psychological distress. It's not. It's prolonged situation, prolonged stress that you can't change. So the situation you're describing of feeling continuously, there's nothing I can do, I can't change this situation, nothing is improving. Now, we see that in people in chronic financial stress, chronic difficulties in employment, caring roles, where they can't see the end of it. So chronic stress is much more important as a risk factor to depression than acute events. Then it becomes, of course, well, what can you do? I mean, and the points you raise about comparison or how you see yourself in relation to that. So being aware of that. I'm glad you raised the responsibility of employers. You know, there are two really important things for your mental health. One's personal autonomy, being able to make changes. The other's social connection, the social world, the relationships you have, being able to have those discussions to keep all of that in perspective. You know, when you get together as a small group, small business association, sharing those stories of small businesses. Well, small businesses have much more autonomy than a lot of big businesses, but, you know, they need to have a wider social network. So these kind of issues are ones that need to be addressed at many different levels of society, including very much in the workplace environment.
Claire, I want to bring you in because the former government upped the number of subsidised psychology appointments to 20 at the height of the COVID-19 pandemic. The government now has halved that, saying it didn't bring in new patients into the system. I wonder if there's a sense around what is part of the political solution here or what needs to be the political focus.
Well, a big issue with mental health from a politics point of view is, you know, going to what Ian was just saying before, where there is this sort of individualised response. It's not like, okay, you've got a broken leg, we know how much a cast is going to cost, we're going to fund that and off you go, an x-ray, whatever. It does take time to probably not only diagnose but then understand how to help someone with clinical depression, which makes it really expensive to fund. And what the current government did was make a decision that they would prefer more people have access to some subsidised psychology support than what they felt was happening, which was people still with absolutely acute need, because obviously GPs were prescribing them the extra sessions. They decided having a smaller group of people having greater depth of help wasn't the greater good. But also what's a really big problem here is because this is such a new and developing kind of area of public health, there isn't the workforce. And so we've seen even recently the government putting money into extra places at universities, in postgrad, in internships, because it's a very, you know, it takes as long to become a psychologist as it does medical doctor, if not longer, depending on the specialisation. So for governments, it's a really pernicious and tricky problem because it is something that still has a lot of misinformation, social stigma attached to it. It's a complex problem to fix and it's really expensive. On top of all of that, we know for the individual that if the expense is a barrier, they are less likely to seek treatment. And when they don't seek treatment, the condition can worsen, meaning it will cost more at the end rather than having an early intervention. So one thing that is interesting that is happening a little bit more is putting more resources into sort of almost self-help tools, early intervention, information, digital resources, in the hope that people are able to sort of identify within themselves or with a friend, relative, co-worker that there might be a need for early intervention or assistance and deal with some of these issues before they become prolonged, more pernicious health problems.
You know, I wonder if you want to weigh in on any of that and perhaps what are some of the solutions here, particularly the point you made earlier about that we haven't seen a real movement in the volume of people that are getting that healthcare.
Right, so we've never built a system in Australia to respond to the size of the problem or the complexity of the problem or the costs associated with optimal care. We keep trying to go, oh, we hope your GP can cope, or we hope you can cope with a short trip to a psychologist, or
which is we know that isn't.
For many people, it's not. And
a
lot of people in different areas, the eating disorder area or more complex psychotic areas, they know it's not enough. Same time, states have retreated from a lot of the provision of this through public hospitals and public areas. So we've got a really big problem. Everyone knows that. The Minister, Mark Butler, is back 10 years later after being the Minister in the Gillard government going, didn't get better, did it? And some of the equity, not just access, but the equity issues got worse. The out-of-pockets got worse in our system because the demand's gone up. Guess what? The supply's greater in the wealthier parts of the country and the costs of getting that care. So I'm part of advisory groups, as are many other people in these areas at the moment. We've got to rethink this. We can't just take mid-20th century solutions and hope we can fit it in. So it's a really challenging area of healthcare policy, and the public debate's really important to actually go, now, do we really prioritise this? When we talk about this expensive care, I'd argue compared with cancer care and surgical care and cardiac care, actually it's not that expensive. And the investment is often in younger people for productive lives. The lifetime costs in this area, a mental wealth concept we pursued a lot with the previous Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull and others, it's worth it, but it's hard. You've got to think about it differently. You've got to think about it in 21st century terms and reach out, I say this down here, Many men just go, this is not the system for me. This is just not how I can connect. I'm not coming forward.
Because it's too hard, or because of the way it's structured?
The way it's structured and the way it expects you to fit in, it just doesn't really connect with people in their lives and where they live and in places they can understand. So one level is trying to drive the literacy. Okay, we got stuff, and we got really good stuff worldwide happening, but that has to translate, like it does in cancer care, like it does in surgical care, into a health system you'd trust, and you'd want to go there with a strong belief that it was really going to help in the ways that did help. And it wasn't being dumbed down, it wasn't being made simple, it wasn't being reduced to something that didn't actually have the effect. People lose confidence in systems when they go and they don't get good health care. They go, well, there's nothing to be gained. See, it wasn't worth the effort. And that's a real struggle. If you're a family member, you're trying to support, you know, a husband, a father, somebody else to get care, a son, that's really hard. So there's so much to be done on that side. It's a big challenge for government. It's been neglected. It's been talked about a lot, but real structural change, including by the professions. This is not all about governments. This is how professions behave, how groups work together, and really what is our expectation about quality healthcare. So the book's all about, know what quality is, go in there and say, I want a quality intervention. So I'm a bit of the, this will be consumer driven, not government determined.
And not saying that there's a quick fix, because
No,
there's simply,
there's
quite
not.
frankly, there is not, as you've explored there. Claire, I want to bring you in as well.
Yeah, I was just going to add, I think one of the other issues is that because, you know, individuals themselves are not necessarily going to be able to immediately identify when something is right for them, is quality, is working. It's not like you go to a GP, get a pain medication, you immediately stop feeling the pain, you know that it was good quality medical care. With this, you know, someone going into a session with a psychologist may not know what they're looking for, what they're trying to feel, and that's really misunderstood. And I think there's a real inherent kind of really complex problem with the way that we deliver mental health support, which is that it's such a new field for the patient themselves that they don't necessarily have the ability to advocate and have agency for themselves. They might just think that, you know, sitting on the couch for an hour and talking for a bit is as good as it gets. So I think just as much as we want to focus on the quality, there does need, as Ian said, to be that awareness piece so that patients can be empowered to go in and get quality care.
Yeah, oh, what a fantastic conversation. Thank you, and thank you for the great book. Well, working less might be one way to better mental health. Medibank is set to become the first publicly listed Australian company to trial a 4-day working week in what it says is an attempt to boost employee wellbeing. The country's biggest healthcare insurer will roll out a 6-month pilot program at the end of the month for 250 of its employees. It's been dubbed the gift, but there'll be no slacking off, with workers cutting back their hours by 20% but being asked to work at full pelt when they're on the clock. Medibank's Chief Customer Officer says he thinks customers will benefit from the move.
We already know from past experience that when our teams have more flexibility and empowerment, our customers are the big beneficiaries. Satisfaction is higher and our people can more quickly and innovatively meet customer needs.
Consumer goods giant Unilever ran a successful 4-day week trial in New Zealand earlier this year and has since expanded the program to 500 Australian employees as well. Naomi, I want to start with you. Is a 4-day work week possible in your business or from where you're sitting more broadly in small business?
Honestly, this is such a complex question. And I'll tell you why. One is because many workers just don't have a choice. They don't have a choice over where they work and definitely not the hours they work. In fact, more and more customers have an expectation of a 24/7 available service. So, you know, you have effectively shift workers, and we also know that shift work is not good for your mental health either. We did see that. So there's a whole part of our community who will not have access to such things. It's always been hard for smaller enterprises to compete, especially with the big global companies when it comes to employee benefits. And so why would somebody choose to work for a smaller business when, you know, they're required to be there when customers are there, which might be 9 to 5, 5 days a week in the 38-hour week, or it might be that they're there, you know, 7 o'clock in the morning because that's when our New Zealand customers come online. You know, there's so many variables, but I'm really concerned that it's going to put many organisations to a disadvantage if this becomes widespread. Now, obviously, any business can make a choice about what's best for its organisation, but ultimately it will affect the whole economy. And this is where we come back to a sense of leadership discussion and looking at across the board the impact this could have. A very long time ago, and I mean last century, when I worked for an airline, I got a rostered day off. It was rather nice once a month, and I could go and do all the things I wanted to do. In fact, I think that rostered day off still remains in many government bodies and large institutions. So perhaps this is, and that's never been in small business, so perhaps this is just an evolution of that. But I am concerned that it's going to become the haves and the have-nots when it comes to employers, and it makes it really challenging. Good on them for giving it a go, though. I did see The Economist did a test of doing a 2-day work week.
Well, there you go. Well,
and they had to work their full hour. They had to get all of their work done in 2 days, and it was unbelievably discriminatory for those people who had childcare and had aged care responsibilities and family responsibilities, and that's another thing.
Sounds like an extreme 2 days that would be. For more, we're joined by Professor at the University of Sydney's Business School and Co-Director of the University of Sydney's Mental Wealth Initiative, John Buchanan. Welcome back to the program.
Thanks for having me.
Can you step me through what this proposal is, and crucially, do you reckon it'll work?
Yes, look, this is the latest stage in the evolution of how advanced societies organise their time. So if you want to put this in a 200-year perspective, with industrialisation, working time spiralled out of control, you know, got up to around 60, 70 hours a week. And things slowly got better. Australia set the standard. It set the 8-hour day in the construction industry in Victoria in the mid-19th century. We pioneered the 40-hour week at the end of the Second World War. People used to come from all over Australia, all over the world, to see how Australia did it. And then we were one of the first countries to embrace the 38-hour week. But then things went wrong. In the late 70s, early 80s, things started to spiral badly out of kilter. In Australia now, full-timers work amongst the longest hours in the OECD, and we have a large number of part-timers, many of whom who don't have enough work. So this initiative has come from a group of people who are saying, we want to get back to a positive trajectory for the changes in working time. It should be seen in that 200-year period. It's the rupture from the late 70s to, you know, the GFC was a kind of experimentation with more power given to markets and the like, and working, to the extent working time was considered an issue, it was all about flexibility. But now people are saying, no, we actually just want to work less. We actually want to have time for friends and family. Living in a civilised society is meaning more than work. And the initiative should be seen in that context. And Juliet Shaw, who's the kind of intellectual leader of this, is like one of the all-time great researchers on working time, and you know, she's certainly putting it in that perspective.
And so is behind this the premise that if you are working fewer days, that you'll be working more productively on those days in order to fit in that volume of work? Is that kind of the...
Yeah, absolutely. So in the labour economics literature, this is called the productivity whip. Like you use a labour standard.
Like you don't want to be getting the rough edge of that.
That's right. So you have a labour standard and you force everything else to adjust to it. So when we had deregulation, you took away labour standards and employers could have a lot more power. This is actually saying, no, we have a standard and we'll force everything else to fit around that, and we force productivity to rise as a result. So I gave you that 200-year period of cutting working time. Productivity went up through that. In fact, there was a classic case in the First World War where munitions workers were getting really fatigued putting in 60-hour weeks for the war effort, and they just couldn't continue it. So they cut it back to 45 hours and output went up. So they actually figured out it was a better way to use their time in a focused way than just dragging it out. Yeah. And there are numerous examples of that kind of thing.
Ian, I wonder if part of the reality of this is that there would be industries where a 4-day week wouldn't necessarily be fit for purpose, that this might be a little bit of kind of navigating this for the industry and how what is required and how it works. I mean, in yours, would you see this working?
Many of us work in areas which don't have these kind of fixed labour rules. We're working all the time, we've got all sorts of technologies, we have high flexibility, high autonomy about what we do. We have a productivity output that has little to do with the formal hours that we're paid. So we're lucky in that sense. We become detached, if you like, from that very formal.
As long as you hit the benchmark of
exactly.
of what
and what has happened in the COVID period, of course, many people are working from home, working very flexibly. It's become about what is their total productivity, not it's a 5-day week, it's a 4-day week, it's a 3-day week. It's all of those things, but with high flexibility, but a requirement to be accountable or productive. In other areas, clearly, if you've got to man certain things, you'd require hospitals to work, you require ambulances to work, you require police, you've got shift work, then you have things that have to be manned, have a workforce there at certain times. And they're the ones who are saying, and humans are not machines. You can't just make them work 5, 6, 7 and get the same output. They have natural rhythms to what they can do, they can concentrate, they can focus on, and then where they need to be spending time doing other things. From a physical and mental health point of view, that's really important to realise. So I think this is a movement towards a recognition of that and how does it work. But there are going to be absolutely really big differences. I think I already see huge differences. I think it's interesting that Medibank said this is for the well-being. I suspect it's to keep the workforce that they want. There's a competition for workers going on.
Yeah.
And what do workers want? Flexibility. What do they want? 4-day week.
This is exactly what Naomi was touching on earlier.
Could I come in with Ian's point there, though? What he's talking about is the difference between working to time and working to task, right? So, but it's what I like about this design principle is it says it doesn't matter whether you're working to time or task. Basically, you shouldn't be working more than 4 days a week, right? So that's the Labor standard discipline. And so you could apply it in a university setting. Equally, you could apply it in a kind of a health insurer. And that's the challenge of this initiative. It's actually saying, as a minimum, we should have a bit more time for things other than work if we're a full-timer. And we should have time that's quarantined for that.
Claire?
I'd like to throw something else into the conversation, seeing that I've got such fabulous people on the panel. There's such a thing called rushing woman's syndrome. And that is that if you have small children and you're rushing to leave the office to pick kids up after school, that, 4 days may not in fact support. And I feel really challenged by many stories I hear about this terrible notion of women almost, and actually all parents, because, it's divide and conquer and all of those sorts of things, not being able to enjoy their children. And this was, in fact, my circumstance. I had a corporate career and I actually gave up my corporate career when I had small children because they were so cute and I wanted to spend time with them. And I got sick of being at somebody else's beck and call. Clearly, there's far more flexibility in the workplace now. But I think... my ideal state would be to reduce hours, but to have it so that you didn't start work until 9:30 after you've dropped the kids off, and you can leave at maybe 2:30 or 3 o'clock so you can see them in the afternoon and support them with their homework and all sorts of other things.
So is this the kind of flexibility that we're actually discussing right now, Naomi?
It is, but if you say 4 days, and sure, that might give somebody, let's say, a 3-day weekend, or that 4th day might be in the middle of the week, wherever they feel it's appropriate. But there's this real thing about challenges with childcare, after-school care, and if it is about productivity, I'd rather see that we looked at a shorter work day, and that we have access to kids or to our parents that we're caring for, or whatever it is. So I'm concerned that we will get honed in on this 4-day work week, which is very different than, let's say, the 38-hour concept, which is, that's for you and your employer to work out what's best in terms of the outcome of the role. But I would like us to consider that maybe it's still 5 days, but we had shorter work hours, so we can spend more time with the people that we care for, and those that we're responsible. And for those who don't, they could get into a hobby or two.
But can't we recognise that the 38-hour work standard has not worked? I mean, that's the reality. I mean, this initiative has come because the current labour standards regime has been atrophying. And I think it's setting a new way of thinking about the debate, and there can be flexibility around it, but it's saying there should be quarantine time, and I think that's a good debate.
Claire, I want to bring you in as well. You haven't had a chance to jump in yet.
I guess it's interesting listening to this. Obviously, my line of work does not subscribe to any form of set hours,
or boundaries on your time,
or boundaries at all. But I don't think I'm alone in that, and I wonder if we are coming up with a solution to the wrong problem. Is the 38-hour week the problem, or is the problem that not many people are actually working 38 hours a week anymore? If you have any kind of job, for example, that requires replying to emails, I would be willing to bet my non-existent house on the fact that you are doing that outside of your 38 hours, that there are so many expectations on a range of professions from employers now that are just physically not possible to be completed within a set 38 hours, no matter how you slice and dice, whether you are lucky enough to be flexible at home or work rotating days to suit caring or other demands. I just think that as fascinating of a social experiment this is in driving productivity in certain services where you obviously have to physically be at work, or you want to have people with the mental acuity and have the rest that enables them to deliver a better performance in the hours they do work, that's great. But I actually think it's kind of corporate cover for the fact that an overwhelming part of our economy relies on workers working well outside the 38 hours that they are paid a week.
But that's exactly the problem. I mean, that's the problem. Workers have accommodated to a regime that hasn't kept up with the changing nature of economic practice. And the beauty of the 4-day work week is it's throwing in a new reference point. And I think that all the arguments you were putting then were arguments against the 10-hour day. They were arguments against the 8-hour day. But if you look back over 2 centuries, we did get working time down. And things always look a bit clumsy or a bit imperfect. But it's this is a statement saying that we should work to live, not live to work. That's what they're saying, and we've got a quarantine time for that. Now, there will be imperfections in the early days, but it's an experiment, right? These 4 days working week is not a universal prescription, but out of that experimentation, you will then find ways of actually delivering on what is both good for the workforce, but also sustainable economically. But at the
John,
moment,
how do you? I mean, the point that Naomi raised, which I think is the big issue now, is around flexibility. I mean, people have the way work happens has changed fundamentally, and COVID's now made it really different. I mean, because really, what people are saying, and last time on this program, so Sam Mostyn talked about female participation in the workforce, parental participation, caring roles. As we've discussed in the Mental Wealth Initiative, a terribly important initiative. People have to go out and do other stuff they're not paid for, called caring, taking care of people, engaging in relationships, which has tremendous societal value. Do you think in that sense, that this discussion about working hours per se, that really the flexibility issue that Naomi raised is really the big issue? How flexible can employment be in the modern age so we can live the lives we want to, but also contribute in the ways we want to? That's of real economic value.
But since the 80s and into the 90s, there's been this obsession with flexibility. And what the 4-day work week's talking about is standards for flexibility. So no one's against flexibility. It's basically been an anything goes story for the last 20 years. And people are saying enough's enough. No, they want flexibility, but you can do that within standards. And just think, the Netherlands, for example, has said, let's think about maybe a 32-hour week spread across 2 people in a household. There are other ways of thinking about it.
This is such a fascinating conversation. We are out of time, though. John Buchanan is a professor at the University of Sydney's Business School. Thanks so much for your company tonight.
Thank you.
How old were you when you first learned to drive? Well, for most of us, it's probably the teens or early 20s. Well, Scotland's former leader has managed to go over 50 years without one until now. Nicola Sturgeon finally has her licence and she couldn't be more proud.
So this happened today. At the tender age of 53, I passed my driving test first time. The whole experience has taken me well out of any notion of a comfort zone, but hopefully proves that it is never too late in life to do something new.
Claire, I want to start with you on the politics. Do you think Australians would tolerate a Prime Minister that didn't have a driver's licence?
Well, I mean, they don't drive well in the job, but I think most Australians would find it a bit strange. I grew up in regional Australia myself, so it was a race to get your P plates as soon as you possibly could.
Yeah, most certainly. Naomi, so it took Nicola Sturgeon actually to leave office before she had the time to learn how to drive. It probably goes to say something about how busy that job was.
Yes, and maybe somebody was driving around for a long period of that because that's what made her productive. But, you know, they do say that as we age, for our mental ability, the more things that we learn, the better off we are. I've recently learned to play cribbage. Nobody's safe now. Most people don't even know what it is.
Well,
it's very old-fashioned.
Do tell us, for anyone who doesn't know, myself included.
It's a card game. It's a really old-fashioned card game with a wooden board as a scoring device. And the other thing that I'm getting keener on is the whole notion of being a handy person. Like I've always said to my husband, "Oh, can you do this? Can you do that?" I've got myself all very self-sufficient lately. He caught me with a drill in my hand. He goes, "What are you doing with that?" And ever since I've said this, now in my social media feed, all I see is two things. I see is handyman. Or I shouldn't say handyman, but tools, how to use tools, how to fix things, and the other one, of course, is dog memes. That's the only two things in my feed. So also both things are made to make me feel inadequate because clearly those dogs are much funnier and faster than mine and lots and lots of years of chisels and all sorts of things I don't yet know about.
When you're doing the handiwork, is it quite therapeutic for you?
Oh, I get completely lost. I've no idea of time. And I've always painted, like I have painted for 40 years, and now I'm like, well, why don't I frame my own paintings? Or maybe I should start doing... And so, yeah, and I'm completely lost. And that is, you know, I'm busy. I work more than 38-hour week. And so allowing myself to be completely involved in learning something new is absolutely delightful. And then my husband says... want some lunch, you know, and I go, what time is it? He goes, 4.
Yes. Ian, how important is it to keep stretching our brains as we get older?
Really important. And the idea that only young people can learn stuff is wrong. It's actually from a brain health point of view. Your brain responds and makes new synaptic connections, new connections between nerve cells when you do new and novel things. So actually as you age, you need to do different things that are hard. Not the same things, new things that are hard to actually make those connections and maintain your brain health. Learn a language, learn a physical instrument. I'm hopeless with DIY anything. I'll be in danger with a drill. You know, but it might be a good time to learn.
Connect you up with Naomi, who might be able to help you out.
I have a friend who's going to teach me to paint. I don't have any ability, but you've got to do stuff that you haven't done that's hard and learn it new. The way you learn it is different as you age, so it's not as easy to pick up some skills as it was earlier in life. You just take a little longer sometimes, but you're smarter. You're smarter about the strategies that are likely to work, and it's really important. This idea that you can't learn with age is wrong. You can, and it needs to be novel and hard.
Yeah, I love that. Claire, we've got about a minute or so left. Have you embarked on learning something new lately?
Have I learned something new lately? I'm sort of trying to learn Spanish on the old Duolingo, which was something I tried to do at the end of university and then got a full-time job and it went out the window. So I suppose that's relatively new in my return to resuming a failed previous attempt.
Love it. That is brilliant. Well, I think there's something from all of us about continuing to learn. Thanks so much for joining in on that. That is all we have time for. Thanks so much to the panel, Ian Hickey, Claire Armstrong and Naomi Simpson. What a cracking yarn tonight. Have an excellent evening. I'll be back with you tomorrow. Good night.